They said she was cursed for bearing only daughters. Her husband beat her for it. Her in-laws starved her for it. But when the mysterious cowboy with the scarred hands saw her youngest daughter hiding bruises under long sleeves, he made a promise that would change everything. What he did next shocked the entire town of Cedar Falls and saved 3 little girls from a fate worse than death. But first, he had to prove that sometimes the most broken people make the strongest families. Cedar Falls, Wyoming, spring of 1874. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street, but inside the Whitmore farmhouse, there was no warmth to be found. Martha Whitmore moved like a ghost through her own kitchen, her thin frame bent with exhaustion and fear. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, and purple bruises painted her wrists like twisted bracelets. She ladled thick beef stew into 3 bowls, the rich smell filling the room. But these bowls weren't for her or her children. They were for the men who ruled this house with iron fists and cruel words. At the wooden table sat Thomas Whitmore, a man whose shoulders had once been strong but were now rounded by drink and disappointment. His weathered hands gripped his spoon like a weapon as he shoveled food into his mouth without a word of thanks. Beside him sat his elderly parents, Mother Whitmore and Father Whitmore, their faces pinched with permanent disapproval. The old woman's gray hair was pulled back, so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl. More bread. Thomas grunted, not bothering to look up at his wife. Martha hurried to slice another thick piece from a loaf, her hands trembling slightly. She placed it beside his bowl and stepped back, head down, waiting. In the corner of the kitchen, 3 small figures huddled together on the cold wooden floor. 8-year-old Ilsa, the oldest, had her arms wrapped protectively around her younger sisters. 6-year-old Rose pressed close against Ilsa's side, while 4-year-old Ava, the baby, curled up like a frightened kitten. Their clothes were nothing more than patched rags, faded and worn thin from too many washings. Their faces were pale and hollow, marked by hunger that had become their constant companion. Ilsa's stomach growled loudly in the silence. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot, and Thomas's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with anger. "Shut that noise up," he barked, pointing his spoon at the children like a sword. "I can't eat in peace with that racket." Ilsa quickly pressed her hand to her stomach, her face burning with shame. She whispered an apology that was barely audible, then pulled her sisters closer, trying to make them all invisible. Mother Whitmore set down her spoon with a sharp click against the bowl. Her cold gray eyes swept over the 3 girls with disgust. 3 daughters, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. 3 daughters and not 1 son. What kind of woman are you, Martha? What kind of wife fails to give her husband a son to carry on his name? Martha's shoulders sagged under the weight of the familiar accusation. She had heard these words every day for 8 years, ever since Ilsa was born. Each daughter that followed had only made it worse. In their eyes, she wasn't just a failure as a wife. She was cursed. "A real woman gives her husband sons," Father Whitmore added, wiping gravy from his gray beard. "Strong boys to work the land and take care of their parents in old age. What good are daughters? They just eat your food and cost you money until some other man takes them away." Thomas nodded in agreement, his face darkening further. Useless mouths to feed. All 3 of them. They eat like horses but can't do a man's work. Can't even do their chores right half the time. As if to prove his point, little Ava shifted slightly and accidentally knocked over an empty tin cup that had been sitting beside her on the floor. The cup rolled across the wooden boards with a hollow rattle that seemed to echo forever in the tense silence. Thomas's chair scraped back as he stood up, his face twisted with rage. "Can't even sit still without causing trouble," he snarled, taking a step toward the 4-year-old. Ilsa immediately jumped to her feet, placing herself between her father and baby Ava. "It was an accident, Papa," she said quickly, her young voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "She didn't mean to." But Thomas was beyond reason. His hand rose high in the air, ready to strike down at the little girl who dared to speak back to him. Martha rushed forward, throwing herself between her husband and daughters. "Please, Thomas," she begged, her voice breaking. "She's just a baby." She didn't know. Thomas's hand froze in midair, his breathing heavy with anger. For a moment, the kitchen held its breath. Then he slowly lowered his arm, but his eyes burned with promise of future punishment. "Get them out of my sight," he growled, "and keep them quiet. I don't want to hear so much as a whisper from any of them for the rest of the day." Martha nodded quickly, gathering her daughters like a hen protecting her chicks. She ushered them toward the small pantry room where they slept on thin blankets spread over the hard floor. As they passed the table, Mother Whitmore's voice followed them like a curse. "Mark my words, Thomas," the old woman said, her voice cold as winter wind. "This family is doomed as long as you're stuck with a wife who can't bear sons. The good Lord is punishing this house for some sin, and these girls are proof of his displeasure." As Martha closed the pantry door behind them, she didn't notice the figure watching from outside the kitchen window. A tall man in a worn cowboy hat stood perfectly still in the morning shadows, his weathered hands clenched into fists at his sides. Ethan Sullivan had been looking for work, traveling from ranch to ranch across Wyoming territory. But what he had just witnessed through that window changed everything. Ethan's dark eyes took in every detail. The fear on the woman's face, the hunger in the children's hollow cheeks, the casual cruelty of the men at the table. But it was the sight of little Ava's sleeve rolling up as she moved that made his jaw clench with barely controlled fury. Purple and yellow bruises marked the 4-year-old's thin arm like fingerprints of violence. Ethan had seen enough. He knew that look of terror, that careful way of moving to avoid triggering anger. It brought back memories of his own childhood, his own father's heavy hands and cruel words. But this time, he wasn't a helpless boy. This time, he could do something about it. He adjusted his hat and walked toward the front door, his boots making deliberate sounds on the wooden porch. When Thomas Whitmore answered his knock, Ethan looked him straight in the eye. "Heard you might need a ranch hand," Ethan said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm good with horses and cattle." "Hard worker." Thomas looked him up and down, taking in Ethan's strong build and calloused hands. "Might be I could use some help," he admitted. "What's your name, stranger?" "Ethan Sullivan," came the reply, "and I'd like to start right away." As Thomas nodded and began discussing wages, Ethan's eyes drifted past him toward the kitchen. Through the doorway, he could see Martha cleaning up the breakfast dishes, her movements quick and nervous. Somewhere in that house, 3 little girls were learning to believe they were worthless. But Ethan Sullivan had other plans. What he was about to do would shock the entire town of Cedar Falls. The mysterious cowboy with rope-scarred hands was about to prove that sometimes the most broken people make the strongest families. And it all started with a promise that would change for lives forever. The question was, could one man stand against years of cruelty and convince 3 daughters that they were worth fighting for? For 3 days, Ethan Sullivan watched. He watched as Martha Whitmore slipped her own breakfast portion onto little Ava's plate when Thomas wasn't looking. He watched Ilsa huddle with her younger sisters behind the woodshed, whispering lessons she'd learned by listening at the schoolhouse window. He watched Rose comfort a crying Ava after Thomas had yanked a book from her hands, calling reading foolishness for females. But it was what he discovered on the 4th morning that changed everything. The sun hadn't yet crested the mountains when Ethan heard soft voices from a barn. Creeping closer, he peered through a gap in the weathered boards. There sat Ilsa, barely 8 years old, using a piece of charcoal to write letters in the dirt floor. Rose and Ava crouched beside her, their eyes wide with concentration. "A, B, C," Ilsa whispered, guiding Ava's tiny finger to trace each letter. "Mama says daughters should know letters too, but Papa says it's wasteful. So we practice here where he can't see." Ethan's chest tightened. This little girl was teaching her sisters in secret, terrified of being caught learning. The injustice of it burned in his throat like swallowed fire. That evening, Ethan made his own investigation of Thomas Whitmore. A visit to the saloon revealed debts that ran deeper than a winter well. Gambling losses to traveling card sharps, money owed to the bank, even tabs at the general store that stretched back months. The man was drowning in debt, and apparently his solution was to rid himself of what he saw as extra mouths to feed. Ethan learned the orphanage plan was set for next week. 3 little girls would be loaded onto a wagon and shipped to Denver, where they'd likely be separated and sent to different homes, if they were lucky. More likely, they'd end up as unpaid servants, their bright minds wasted on endless chores and thankless labor. That night, Ethan stared at the stars and made his decision. Those girls deserve better. Martha deserved better. And if no one else would stand up for them, then by God, he would. He'd seen what happened when good people did nothing. He wouldn't let it happen again. The next morning, Ethan found Martha alone in the barn, milking their thin cow. Her shoulders sagged with exhaustion, and purple bruises on her wrists told the story of another discussion with Thomas about her failures as a wife. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ethan said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, fear flickering across her face before she schooled it into polite attention. "Mr. Sullivan, do you need something? I need to talk to you about your daughters." Martha's hands stilled on the milk pail. "If they've been bothering you." "They haven't." Ethan knelt in the straw beside her, his voice gentle but urgent. "I know about the orphanage, ma'am. I know Thomas plans to send them away next week." Martha's face went white. "How did you?" She shook her head, pressing her lips together. "It doesn't matter. There's nothing to be done about it." "There is." Ethan took a deep breath. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll buy this land from Thomas, pay off his debts, and I'll marry you, if you'll have me. Adopt the girls legally so no one can ever take them from you again." Martha stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign tongue. "Why would you? I'm a cursed woman, Mr. Sullivan. I brought only daughters into this world. Thomas says I'm worthless, and maybe he's right. Why would any man want to saddle himself with 3 girls who'll never—" "Stop." Ethan's voice was firm but kind. "You listen to me, Martha Whitmore. You're not cursed. Your daughters aren't burdens. They're gifts this family has been too blind and too foolish to see." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks. "You don't understand what you're saying. Ilsa asks too many questions. Rose is too strong-willed for a girl. And Ava, she's different, too clever by half. Thomas says." "Thomas is an idiot." Ethan reached out and gently covered her hands with his scarred ones. "I've watched Ilsa teach her sisters to read in secret. I've seen Rose gentle that mean old rooster that pecks everyone else. And Ava, that child has a mind like a steel trap. These aren't flaws, Martha. These are strengths. But they're girls," Martha whispered, as if stating the obvious. "Yes," Ethan said firmly, "and I'll raise them proud to be girls. I'll make sure they know reading isn't wasteful, that being strong-willed isn't shameful, and that being clever is something to celebrate, not hide." Martha studied his face, searching for the lie, the trick, the cruelty that experience had taught her to expect from men. But all she saw was steady determination and something she hadn't seen in years. "Hope." "You'd really do this?" she whispered. "For us." "Ma'am," Ethan said, "I'd consider it an honor." Thomas Whitmore laughed when Ethan made his offer, until he heard the numbers. "You're offering to pay my debts?" Thomas's bloodshot eyes sharpened with sudden interest. "All of them." "Every cent," Ethan confirmed, "plus $500 extra for a clean slate. In exchange, you sign over the land deed, agree to the marriage, and relinquish all parental rights to the girls." Thomas's face went through several expressions: surprise, suspicion, then calculating greed. "Why would you want my land? It's barely profitable." "That's my concern, not yours." "Am I my wife? The girls?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "They deserve better than you. Sign the papers, take the money, and walk away. Thomas hesitated, but the promise of a fresh start was too tempting. By sundown, the deal was done. Land, marriage, and daughter signed over to Ethan Sullivan. The Cedar Falls courthouse had never witnessed a ceremony quite like this one. Martha stood beside Ethan in her only decent dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better years. But for the first time in memory, her spine was straight, her chin lifted. Beside them, three little girls watched with wide, uncertain eyes, still not quite believing this was real. Judge Patterson performed the brief ceremony with unusual solemnity, perhaps sensing the weight of what was truly happening here. We pronounced them husband and wife. Ethan turned not to kiss his bride, but to kneel before the three daughters who were now, legally and forever, his own. Ilsa, he said, taking the 8-year-old's small hands in his scarred ones. You're going to read every book in this territory. I promise you that. Ilsa's breath caught. Really? Even the ones Papa said were too hard for girls. Especially those ones. He turned to Rose, whose 6-year-old frame already showed the defiant strength that had kept her sisters safe. Rose, you're going to learn to handle any horse that walks God's green earth. Would you like that? Rose nodded so vigorously her braids bounced. Can I really? Mama said girls don't ride like that. My daughter rides however she wants to ride. Finally, Ethan looked in a 4-year-old Ava's solemn face. This tiny girl who could already count to 100, who saw patterns in numbers that adults missed, who hid her brilliance like a shameful secret. Ava, he said gently, you're going to grow up knowing you're precious, that your mind is a gift, not a curse. Do you understand me? Ava's lower lip trembled. You won't send us away when we're too much trouble? Ethan's voice was steady as stone. Never. You're my daughters now. That means forever. For the first time in their young lives, 3 little girls heard an adult man speak to them with kindness, with respect, with love. The transformation had begun. Ethan's ranch house was modest. Just 4 rooms and a stone fireplace. But to Martha and the girls, it might as well have been a palace. These are your beds, Ethan announced, leading them to a room he'd hastily furnished with 3 small beds, each with real mattresses, clean sheets, and warm quilts. No more sleeping on kitchen floors. The girls stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to enter. Ava whispered, "Are you sure it's allowed?" Martha's eyes filled with tears. In her old life, the girls had slept on thin rags by the dying kitchen fire, grateful for even that small warmth. Real beds were luxuries she'd never dared dream they might have. It's not just allowed, Ethan said firmly. It's required. My daughters sleep in proper beds. While the girls explored their new room with hushed wonder, Ethan built a fire in the yard. Martha watched, confused, as he emerged from the house, carrying the bundle of floor rags and tattered blankets that had been the girls' only bedding. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making sure you never go back." Ethan tossed the rags onto the flames. "You're never sleeping on floors again. Any of you." As the old life literally went up in smoke, Rose tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Mr. Ethan, are we really allowed to talk? At Papa's house, we had to be quiet." Ethan crouched to her level. "Rose, in this house, you're encouraged to talk. I want to hear your thoughts, your questions, your ideas. All of you." That first dinner was a revelation. Ethan had prepared a simple meal, beef stew, fresh bread, milk for the girls. But it was the most food they'd seen at one time in months. More importantly, they were allowed to sit at the table like family, not wait for scraps like unwanted pets. "Tell me about yourselves," Ethan said as they ate. "What do you like to do? What do you dream about?" The girls exchanged uncertain glances. No adult had ever asked them such questions. Ilsa ventured first. "I like letters and numbers. I want to learn about faraway places." "Then you will," Ethan promised. Slowly, carefully, 3 little girls began to speak. And as they did, Martha saw something she hadn't seen in years. Her daughters' personalities emerging from the shadows where fear had hidden them. The broken family Thomas Whitmore had discarded was beginning to heal. The real transformation began the next morning. Ethan woke before dawn and found Ilsa already awake, staring out the window at the sunrise. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. "I don't want to miss anything," she whispered. "What if I wake up and this is all a dream?" "It's not a dream, sweetheart. This is your life now." Ethan sat beside her on the bed. "And we're going to make it a good one. Would you like to start your real education today?" Ilsa's eyes went wide. Real education? By breakfast time, Ethan had pulled out a stack of books he'd brought from his uncle's ranch. Advanced readers, mathematics primers, even a basic astronomy text. Ilsa's hands shook as she touched the leather bindings. "These are for me. These are just the beginning." While Ilsa buried herself in a reader far more advanced than anything she'd seen, Ethan took Rose to meet the horses. The 6-year-old had always been drawn to animals, but Thomas had forbidden her from going near the valuable livestock. "This is Copper," Ethan said, introducing her to a gentle mare. "She's been lonely for company. Think you could help with that?" Within an hour, Rose was brushing Coppa's coat with the dedication of a born horsewoman. "She likes me," Rose breathed in wonder. "Of course she does. You have a gift with animals, Rose. We're going to develop that gift." Meanwhile, Ava proved that her mathematical abilities were even more remarkable than Ethan had suspected. When he casually mentioned that he needed to calculate feed costs for winter, Ava piped up, "If you have 12 horses and each horse eats 20 pounds of hay per day, that's 240 pounds daily. For 120 winter days, you need 28,800 pounds, which is 14.4 tons. Ethan stared at the 4-year-old. "You did that in your head?" Ava nodded, then looked worried. "Was I not supposed to? Papa always got angry when I knew numbers." "Ava," Ethan said firmly, "in this house, being smart is something to be proud of." But even as the girls blossomed under his care, Ethan knew the real test was coming. The people of Cedar Falls had watched him take on Thomas Whitmore's burdens, and they were waiting to see if he'd regret his decision. What happened next would shock the entire town and prove that daughters, when given love and opportunity, could accomplish anything. 6 months after the wedding, the drought came. By July, the creek beds had turned to cracked earth, and the few remaining water sources were jealously guarded by the established ranchers who'd held water rights for decades. When the Cedar Falls Cattlemen's Association called an emergency meeting, Ethan Sullivan wasn't invited. "You're an outsider," Sam Morrison, the association president, told him bluntly when Ethan showed up anyway. "This is about water rights that go back generations. You wouldn't understand the complexities." Ethan felt the familiar burn of exclusion, but this time he had an idea that would shock them all. "You're right," he said calmly. "I don't understand all the complexities, but I know someone who does." The next morning, every rancher in the valley stared in disbelief as Ethan Sullivan rode up to the association meeting with an 8-year-old girl sitting straight back beside him in the saddle. "Gentlemen," Ethan announced as he lifted Ilsa down, "meet my daughter Ilsa. She's here as my representative." "You can't be serious," Morrison sputtered. "This is a business meeting, not a children's social." "Then you'd better listen carefully," Ethan replied, "because my daughter is about to save your ranches." Ilsa stepped forward, her small hands clutching a carefully drawn map. Despite her youth, her voice was clear and confident, a far cry from the frightened child who'd once hidden from her father's anger. "Gentlemen," she began, "you're fighting over 3 main water sources while ignoring 17 smaller ones that could supply your needs." The room fell silent. Ilsa unrolled her map, revealing a detailed survey of every creek, spring, and seasonal water source within 50 miles. "I've spent 3 months walking this territory with my father, measuring water flow, calculating capacity, and mapping underground springs you've never bothered to explore." She pointed to a section north of town. "There's an artesian well here that could supply the Morrison and Tucker ranches, Mr. Fletcher. Your cattle are dying because you're trying to share Devil's Creek with 4 other ranchers. But there's a year-round spring just 2 miles northeast of your property line. One by one, Ilsa laid out solutions that none of these seasoned ranchers had considered. She had memorized every geographical feature, calculated water volumes with mathematical precision, and developed a resource-sharing plan that would save every ranch in the valley. When she finished, the room was dead quiet. Finally, old Tom Fletcher cleared his throat. "Little miss, how do you know about that spring near my land?" Ilsa smiled. "Because I pay attention, Mr. Fletcher. And because my father taught me that being smart isn't something to hide." Morrison looked from Ilsa to Ethan, his expression shifting from skepticism to grudging respect. This could actually work. "It will work," Ilsa said simply, "if you stop thinking like it's 1850 and start thinking like it's 1875. Water scarcity requires cooperation, not competition." By the end of the meeting, Ilsa's plan had been unanimously approved. More importantly, the men of Cedar Falls had witnessed something they'd never expected: a little girl whose intelligence surpassed their own. As they rode home, Ethan felt his chest swell with pride. "How does it feel to be the smartest person in the room?" he asked. Ilsa considered this seriously. "It feels like I don't have to hide anymore." While Ilsa was conquering the business world, Rose was facing her own challenge. For months, a wild Mustang had been terrorizing the local herds, a magnificent black stallion that had bucked off every cowboy brave enough to try breaking him. Men had tried ropes, whips, and sheer force. The horse had hospitalized 2 riders and earned a reputation as unbreakable. "That devil horse is costing us money," complained Rancher Bill Hayes. "Maybe we should just shoot it." 9-year-old Rose Sullivan overheard this conversation and felt her heart break. That evening, she approached Ethan with tears in her eyes. "Papa, Ethan, they want to hurt the black horse. But he's not mean, he's scared." Ethan studied his daughter's determined face. "What makes you think that?" "I watch him sometimes. He only fights when men come at him angry. Animals know when people want to hurt them." Against every instinct and the advice of every rancher in the territory, Ethan allowed Rose to approach the Mustang, but not with ropes or force, with patience. For 3 weeks, Rose sat at the fence of the corral where the stallion was penned, simply talking to him. She brought him apples, spoke softly about her day, and never made a sudden move. On the 4th week, something magical happened. The stallion, who tried to savage every man who'd come near him, gently nuzzled Rose's outstretched hand. Within a month, Rose had not only broken the unbreakable horse, but had trained him to saddle, bridle, and ride. She named him Midnight, and their bond became legendary throughout the territory. Word spread quickly. Ranchers began bringing their most difficult horses to Ethan Sullivan's girl, and Rose never failed to work her quiet magic. "How does she do it?" visiting cowboys would ask. Ethan would smile and say, "She listens with her heart instead of her ego." The youngest Sullivan daughter's moment of recognition came at Henderson's general store. Old Pete Henderson had been struggling with his account books for months, growing more frustrated each day as numbers refused to balance. His wife suggested hiring an accountant from Denver, but Pete was too proud to admit he needed help. 6-year-old Ava was in the store with Martha when she overheard Pete muttering about his financial troubles. "Mr. Henderson," Ava said politely, "your accounts don't balance because you recorded Mrs. Morrison's flour purchase on Tuesday as $4.37, but you charged her $4.73. You also forgot to add the credit for the Johnson family's return harness." Pete stared at the little girl in astonishment. "How could you possibly know that?" "I listened while you read the numbers to Mrs. Henderson yesterday. You have 17 errors in just the pages I heard. Would you like me to find the others?" Within 2 hours, Ava had identified every mathematical error in Pete's books and corrected calculations that had been wrong for months. Her photographic memory for numbers was matched only by her intuitive understanding of mathematical relationships. Word of Ava's gift spread like wildfire. Soon, shopkeepers, ranchers, and even the town banker were quietly consulting the Sullivan child, when their numbers wouldn't cooperate. Martha watched in amazement as her youngest daughter, the child Thomas had called too clever by half in anger, was celebrated for the very qualities he'd tried to suppress. "She's extraordinary," the banker told Ethan. "I've never seen mathematical intuition like hers, not even in trained accountants." Ethan nodded proudly. "All my daughters are extraordinary. The world just needed to give them a chance to show it." But even as the community began to recognize the girls' remarkable abilities, their greatest challenge was still ahead. Someone from their past was about to return. Someone who could destroy everything Ethan had built and everything the girls had become. The final test of Ethan's promise was coming, and this time, the stakes would be higher than anyone could imagine. 2 years had passed since Ethan Sullivan transformed 3 broken little girls into the pride of Cedar Falls. Ilsa, now 10, was teaching advanced mathematics to children twice her age. Rose had earned respect throughout the territory as the finest horse trainer in 3 counties. 6-year-old Ava managed financial records for half the businesses in town. The Sullivan family had found peace, prosperity, and most importantly, love. Then Thomas Whitmore stumbled back into their lives like a bad nightmare, refusing to end. He arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday evening, drunk and desperate, his clothes filthy from weeks on the trail. The money Ethan had paid him was long gone, gambled away in Denver saloons, and lost to confidence men who'd spotted an easy mark from miles away. "I want my family back," Thomas slurred, swaying on Ethan's front porch. "My wife, my daughters. You stole them from me, Sullivan." Ethan stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him to shield Martha and the girls from the confrontation he'd always known would come. "You sold them to me, Thomas. Fair and square. We both signed papers. I was drunk. I wasn't thinking straight." Thomas's voice rose dangerously. "Those are my blood daughters in there. My property. No court in the territory will side with a stranger over their real father." Through the window, Ethan could see Martha's pale face, her hand protectively on Ava's shoulder. Ilsa and Rose flanked their mother, their young faces showing the same fear that had haunted them in the old life. "Real father." Ethan's voice was deadly quiet. "You mean the man who beat them for being born female? The man who planned to ship them to an orphanage like unwanted cattle?" Thomas waved dismissively. "I was teaching them discipline. They needed to learn their place. But you've ruined them, filling their heads with nonsense about reading and writing and thinking they're as good as boys." "They're better than boys," Ethan said firmly. "They're better than any of us." "We'll see about that." Thomas pulled out a crumpled legal paper. "I've got Sheriff Morrison and a court order. Custody hearing tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Judge Patterson will see that children belong with their natural father, not some soft-hearted fool who doesn't know how to raise daughters proper." Ethan's blood ran cold. In 1876, Father's rights were nearly absolute. Courts rarely sided against biological parents, regardless of circumstances. Everything he'd built, everything the girls had become, could be destroyed with one judge's decision. The Cedar Falls courthouse had never been so packed. Word of the custody hearing had spread through the territory like wildfire, and it seemed every resident had come to witness the battle for the Sullivan girls' future. Thomas sat at the plaintiff's table, cleaned up and sober for the occasion, playing the role of wronged father. He'd even managed to find a suit and had practiced a speech about wanting to reclaim his daughters and restore proper family order. At the defendant's table, Ethan sat beside Martha, whose hands shook as she gripped her wedding ring. Behind them, Ilsa, Rose, and Ava sat in their best dresses, their faces pale but determined. Judge Patterson called the court to order, his expression grave. "This is a custody dispute between Thomas Whitmore, biological father, and Ethan Sullivan, adoptive father of Ilsa, Rose, and Ava. Mr. Whitmore, present your case." Thomas stood, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a seasoned liar. "Your Honor, I made a mistake 2 years ago. I was grieving, overwhelmed by financial hardship, and I made a rash decision to let Mr. Sullivan take my family. But these are my daughters, my blood. A man should have the right to raise his own children." He gestured toward the girls. "Look how Mr. Sullivan has confused them, teaching them skills meant for boys, filling their heads with ideas above their station. Daughters need firm guidance, proper feminine training. They need their real father." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Several of the older men nodded approvingly. Traditional values ran deep in Cedar Falls. But then Judge Patterson did something unexpected. "Before I make my decision," he announced, "I'd like to hear from the children themselves. Ilsa, would you please approach the bench?" 10-year-old Ilsa walked forward with the confidence Ethan had helped her build. Gone was the frightened child who'd once hidden from her father's anger. "Ilsa," Judge Patterson said gently, "can you tell the court about your life with Mr. Sullivan?" Ilsa's voice rang clear and strong. "Your Honor," before Papa Ethan, "I couldn't read past primer books. Now I've read Dickens, Shakespeare, and advanced mathematics texts. I can survey land, calculate water rights, and solve problems that help our entire community." She turned to face the packed courtroom. "Mr. Thomas, I won't call him father anymore. He told me reading was wasteful for girls. Papa Ethan told me reading would set me free." Rose stepped forward next, her chin raised defiantly. "I could train horses that grown men couldn't handle. I earn honest money with skills Papa Ethan taught me. Thomas Whitmore would have sent me to an orphanage for being troublesome. Ethan Sullivan made me proud to be strong." Finally, 8-year-old Ava approached the bench, her mathematical mind choosing each word with precision. "Your Honor, Thomas Whitmore called me too clever by half and tried to beat the intelligence out of me. Ethan Sullivan calls me brilliant and helped me use my gifts to serve others. One man tried to break me. The other helped me soar." The courtroom fell silent as 3 articulate, confident young women defended the man who believed in them when no one else would. Judge Patterson removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, the gesture giving weight to his coming words. The entire courthouse held its breath. "In my 30 years on this bench," he began, "I have never encountered a case quite like this one. The law typically favors biological parents, but the law also demands that I consider the best interests of the children involved." He looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Whitmore, you claim parental rights, but parental rights come with parental responsibilities. You abandoned these children when they needed you most. You sold them to settle your debts. You cannot now claim to want them back simply because your circumstances have changed." Thomas started to protest, but Patterson silenced him with a raised hand. "More importantly," the judge continued, "I have witnessed something remarkable today. These children are not merely surviving under Mr. Sullivan's care. They are thriving beyond anything I thought possible. Ilsa's intelligence, Rose's skill with animals, Ava's mathematical gifts, these are not accidents. They are the fruits of love, encouragement, and proper guidance." The judge's voice grew firm. "No court in this territory would remove children from a home where they are flourishing and place them with a man who has already proven his unfitness as a father." He brought down his gavel with finality. "Custody remains with Ethan and Martha Sullivan. Thomas Whitmore is ordered to stay away from his family or face jail time for harassment." The courtroom erupted in cheers as Thomas stormed out, defeated and alone. But the real victory was quieter. 3 young women standing tall, surrounded by a community that finally saw their true worth, protected by a man who'd kept every promise he'd ever made to them. The final test was over. Ethan Sullivan had won. 5 years after the courthouse battle that changed everything, Ilsa Sullivan stood before a classroom of eager faces, some younger than her, some older, all hanging on every word of Wyoming Territory's youngest certified schoolteacher. At 15, Ilsa had accomplished what most women twice her age never dreamed possible. She'd passed every teaching examination with perfect scores, mastered subjects from advanced mathematics to classical literature, and earned the respect of the territorial school board. Today we're going to explore why the square root of negative numbers was even considered impossible. Ilsa announced to her mixed class of boys and girls. Until mathematicians realized that impossibility was just a limitation of their thinking, not mathematics itself. In the back of the classroom, Ethan Sullivan watched with quiet pride as his eldest daughter commanded the room with natural authority. She'd grown into a confident young woman whose intelligence was matched only by her compassion for struggling students. After class, as Ilsa organized her materials, a delegation of territorial officials approached Ethan. Mr. Sullivan, the head of the school board, said, "We'd like to offer Ilsa a permanent position as head teacher. We're also recommending her for the new teachers' college they're establishing in Cheyenne." Ethan felt his chest swell. "What do you think, Ilsa?" Ilsa looked up from her books, her eyes bright with possibility. "I think I'd like to train other women to teach, Papa Ethan. If we can prove that daughters can excel in education, maybe more families will invest in their girls' minds instead of just their marriage prospects." "That's my daughter," Ethan said proudly to the officials, always thinking about lifting others up. As they walked home, Ilsa slipped her arm through Ethan's. "Remember when you promised I'd read every book in the territory?" Ethan chuckled. "I do. I think I need a bigger territory." The sound of thundering hooves announced Rose Sullivan's arrival at the Cedar Falls Stock Show. But this wasn't just any rider approaching. At 13, Rose had built the most successful horse breeding and training operation in 3 counties, and her reputation stretched all the way to the California coast. She dismounted from Thunder, a magnificent stallion she'd trained from a wild colt, and surveyed the gathering of ranchers and buyers who'd come to see her latest horses. Her operation wasn't just about training anymore. Rose had developed innovative breeding techniques that produced horses renowned for their intelligence, stamina, and gentleness. "Gentlemen," Rose announced to the crowd, her voice carrying the confidence Ethan had nurtured in her, "today you'll see why Sullivan horses are sought after from Denver to San Francisco." She spent the morning demonstrating horses that responded to voice commands, performed complex maneuvers, and showed the kind of trust that came only from patient, respectful training. Buyers competed fiercely for her stock, and by noon, Rose had sold 6 horses for prices that made seasoned ranchers shake their heads in amazement. But the real breakthrough came when Jeremiah Foster, president of the Colorado Cattlemen's Association, approached her with an unprecedented offer. "Miss Sullivan," he said, tipping his hat respectfully, "our association has voted unanimously to invite you to become our first female member. Your methods have revolutionized horse training throughout the territory." Rose smiled, remembering the frightened 6-year-old who'd once been forbidden to touch the horses. "Mr. Foster, I'd be honored. But I have one condition. My membership includes the right to train other women in these methods." Foster nodded eagerly. "Agreed. We need more people who understand horses the way you do." As Ethan watched from the sidelines, he marveled at how his daughter had taken her natural gifts and built something that was changing an entire industry. Other families were beginning to encourage their daughters to work with animals, inspired by Rose's success. The girl who'd once been called too strong-willed was now celebrated for her strength. At 11 years old, Ava Sullivan managed the financial records for 6 different businesses in Cedar Falls, but her dreams stretched far beyond bookkeeping. The afternoon mail brought a letter that would change everything. Correspondence from Harvard Law School, responding to the legal brief Ava had submitted on women's property rights in the territories. "Papa Ethan," Ava called, her voice trembling with excitement. "You need to see this." Ethan found his youngest daughter holding the letter with reverent care. Her mathematical genius had evolved into a passion for legal logic, and she'd been corresponding with law professors across the country. "They want to discuss my legal theories," Ava announced. "Professor Williams says my brief on territorial property law is more sophisticated than work he's seen from third-year law students." Ethan wasn't surprised. Ava's mind worked on multiple levels simultaneously. She could calculate complex financial projections while analyzing legal precedents and still help her sisters with their challenges. "They're suggesting I could enter their pre-law program in 3 years," Ava continued, "which would make me the youngest student they've ever accepted. Papa Ethan, I could become Wyoming's first female lawyer." Ethan knelt beside his brilliant daughter, the child who'd once hidden her intelligence like a shameful secret. "Ava, you could become anything you want to become. The world is finally ready for minds like yours." Martha Sullivan stood in her kitchen, preparing Sunday dinner for a family that had grown far beyond blood relations. The dining room table would soon hold not just Ethan and the three girls, but also Ilsa's advanced students who came for weekend tutoring, young women who traveled from neighboring towns to learn horse training from Rose, and aspiring business people who sought Ava's financial advice. The woman who'd once cowered in fear, convinced she was cursed for bearing daughters, had herself become a pillar of the community. Martha now led the newly formed Women's Education Committee, helping other wives and mothers discover their own worth and potential. Mrs. Sullivan, her neighbor Rebecca Thompson, had said just last week, "Watching your family gave me the courage to ask my husband to let our daughter Mary attend school. She wants to be a teacher like Ilsa." Martha smiled at the memory. The ripples of Ethan's belief in her daughters had spread throughout Cedar Falls and beyond. Families who'd once seen daughters as burdens were now investing in their education, encouraging their dreams, and celebrating their achievements. Her marriage to Ethan had deepened from gratitude into genuine love, the kind of partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The curse had become a blessing that blessed others. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Ethan and Martha sat on their front porch, watching their three daughters teach a group of neighborhood girls. Ilsa was explaining advanced mathematics, Rose was demonstrating proper horse care, and Ava was helping a young girl understand basic accounting principles. "You kept your promise," Martha said softly, her hand finding Ethan's weathered one. "You raised them proud." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "They raised themselves proud, Martha. I just gave them permission to shine." Across the yard, 13-year-old Ilsa was encouraging a frustrated student. "Intelligence isn't about never making mistakes. It's about learning from them and trying again." 11-year-old Rose was patiently showing a timid girl how to approach a horse. "Confidence doesn't mean being fearless. It means being brave enough to try despite your fears." 9-year-old Ava was helping a merchant's daughter with calculations. "Your mind is a gift, not something to hide. Use it to help others, and you'll never lack for purpose." Ethan felt his throat tighten with emotion. Three confident young women, each excelling in her chosen field, each lifting others as they climbed. The frightened, broken children he'd first met were gone, replaced by strong, capable individuals who were changing their world. The promise was more than fulfilled. It had created a legacy that would echo through generations. Sometimes the greatest strength comes from believing in someone when the whole world says they're worthless. Ethan Sullivan didn't just save three little girls. He proved that daughters, when given love and opportunity, can change the world. His promise echoed through Cedar Falls and beyond, inspiring other families to see their daughters not as burdens, but as the brilliant, capable individuals they truly were. If this story moved you, if you believe every child deserves a chance to shine regardless of gender, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and the power of believing in someone. Because somewhere out there, another little girl needs to know she's worth fighting for. Share this story and help us spread the message that every daughter deserves to be raised proud.